This is my video lecture on the state of Western society, or maybe the development of Western society. In particular, this is an approach, let's say, that a social scientist or a history of ideas might take in order to provide a kind of taxonomy or a heritage of social belief and progress, so to speak, so that people who are in that particular time period might understand how they got to that epoch, and these are their heritage. So, so Penner, who is our reading, the apologetic theology book that we're going to read, Penner thinks that Christians have to change the way they defend the faith because we are living in a postmodern world rather than a modern world. Now let me say that in this social science kind of talk, modern world does not mean current or contemporary. Modern is a particular epoch or way of thinking. So that postmodern is the epoch or mental environment that follows upon the modern world or the modern epoch. So from now on, for the video lectures or any discussion that we have with respect to apologetics or postmodernism or Penner, modern always means that, which we'll get to in the next 10 or 15 minutes, rather than contemporary or current. Okay, that having been said, I'm going to start here with the ancient world. And in the ancient world, the mental environment of the ancient world was organized around the principle of nature. And that is that everything that is follows its nature. And it is a perfect example of what it is supposed to be as long as it corresponds to its nature. This is particularly the way in which Stoic philosophers thought about things. This is a good example of X if this example of X is doing what X things are supposed to do. So that in the ancient world, even God is subject to nature. So they would say to one another as philosophers within their particular society, as people living in that era, hey, look, even the gods must act in accordance with godlike nature. So that you might have a hierarchy of being, and gods may be at the top of the hierarchy of being, but all the gods are subjected to nature, so that you have gods and demigods and humans and whatever else is in nature. But everything on this hierarchy is subjected to nature, so that even the gods themselves are subjected to nature. Which is one of the reasons why Aristotle will start talking about this high God that is beyond all these natural things, because that high God is not subjected to this nature and these natural hierarchies and natural expectations. But we don't know who that God is, because everything that we know of is subjected to the natures that we can perceive. So that even the gods were a part of nature for Aristotle, but there must have been a God that is outside of all of those natures. And that's what he would have called the prime mover or the first cause, which we'll talk about next week in a video lecture. But suffice to say for now that in the ancient world, everything that we know of is always subjected to nature and the prescriptions and attributes that you would see within those natures. When you move out of the ancient world into the medieval world takes as its cues, I'm talking about Western society, the medieval world takes as its cues the Christian faith, and how the Christian faith brings alteration to the mental environment of Western society. The organizing principle of the medieval world is God. It's not nature, it's God. And so God is the one who, as creator, puts in place how things should operate within nature, within the world. God is the one who sets the expectations. God is the one who kind of programs various things to act in various ways based upon their natures. Now, I don't mean by program destines them, because because program doesn't mean something is going to do what God wants them to do, but program simply means sets the parameters around which a thing functions. Now, that thing may function poorly or well, but it will function poorly or well if you're talking about a human, will function poorly or well based upon their choices to act in accord with what God has prescribed. So God is the creator. God puts things in motion. God is the creator and designer. And that human beings, amongst other things, perform based upon the nature that they have. And humans perform not only based upon their nature, but also based upon what they choose to do. So the organizing principle in the medieval world is God. And what is good, you find out from God, because God is the creator. God prescribes. Good comes from what God has prescribed. And you, as a human, are good insofar as you follow that prescription and you do what is right, etc., based upon what God has described. When you get into the modern world, there is a calling into question about God as the organizing principle. When people in the modern world start moving outside of their Western society, they start moving outside of Christendom, that is the Christian Western society and mental environment, they start seeing that, look, there are people who have these different gods. They don't subscribe to this one rendition of deity. You not only have Christians and Jews, but over there in Arabia and in the Middle East and in Asia Minor, you have Muslims who have a very different view of God, but yet they still say it's God. But then whenever you're moving into other places of the world, you're going to India, you're making trade routes to China, you're going down into Africa, these Europeans are going to the so-called New World, and they see these indigenous peoples, and they all talk about these higher beings and gods and spirits. So they start saying to themselves, okay, look, God isn't the organizing principle of reality, because all of these humans have different ideas about what that God is. So the organizing principle by which the world is known is human reason, because humans are the ones who make the categories by which humans understand their world. So what you have to do, what humans have to do, is they have to utilize their reason in such a way humans use their reason in such a way so that it makes, skip all that. The thing that is universal in the world is not notions of God, but that humans use their reason to develop categories about God. So it's human reason which is the organizing principle, because all humans have reason. So the categories that people develop, the definitions of God and the religions that they construct, are constructed from human reason, not from God or given by God. Revelation is so sloppy that we should just start thinking about the organizing principle of the world being human reason. So within the Enlightenment, they start talking about how human reason as the organizing principle needs to be what all people share and can bring all people into this common humanity. And so the goal in the modern world, or the post-Enlightenment world, is to utilize human reason and rationality in such a way that all people of reason can agree to these certain principles and ideas that everybody can come to an awareness of. I think about the use of reason in the modern world as the mathematical principle of least common denominator. So, for instance, let's see, I'm trying to get a color here. So, for instance, in math, you've got this, and you've got this. Now, to the uneducated, that right there looks like three different numbers. It is three different numbers, but it looks like it has three different values. The uneducated person sees these differences and think that they are value differences. But the person who is educated, the person who uses their reason and their rationality properly and appropriately, will know and recognize that these three different numbers actually can be reduced, least common denominator, to one value. The three different numbers have one value. And the reasonable, rational person can see that. So whenever you're talking about God, God is a category in some people's minds, or a way of thinking in some people's minds, that may have a certain number to it, the Christian number. But all of these religions can be reduced to the lowest common denominator. That's where pluralism comes from. Pluralism is a way in the modern mindset to account for the different religions and to account for them in such a way to say all of them are getting to the same place. So in the modern world, with respect to some of their values in the modern world, you have, I've put these four names up on the board because within the modern world, based upon this notion of human reason as an organizing principle, they develop ideas that fund the mindset and mental environment of the modern world. So Galileo starts calling into question a Earth-centric universe in favor of heliocentricity, that the Earth revolves around the sun rather than the sun revolving around the Earth, and starts paving the way to talk about the cosmos as a mechanism, as a system or a machine. Now, when he started doing that and started talking about it, things about it in that way, it made it seem as if you can't trust divine providence, or that maybe that God isn't actually involved in this world. That certainly there is a God, but that God created and set things on a course and then kind of disappeared. And so you have in the modern world, based upon this kind of mechanistic idea, because all the world now is a mechanism that the mind can apprehend, God is simply the machinist who puts it all together and then leaves. We call this deism in terms of a religious idea, that God set things in motion and kind of left. And so Galileo in his mechanistic universe makes it possible. Now Galileo is a Christian, but he made it possible for people to start calling into question divine involvement. And then you get the next guy, Darwin, who didn't like and we'll talk about this next week, but he didn't like the proof that there was a God that a guy named William Paley put forward. His idea was that that there was a designer, and that the design of the world suggests to us that there is a God. So what Darwin started talking about was, things got here through chance and matter and natural selection, not through a creator. Because Darwin looked around and thought, I could conceive of a better job than this. I mean, look at all this stuff, right? It's violence and blood and tooth and nail and claw. It's survival of the fittest. There are systems in place that are not optimal systems, and if there is this super mundane beneficent being, certainly it would create things optimally. So this seems to be kind of a chance construct. So Darwin's theory, that was actually propagated as a response to a Christian theistic proof, William Paley, begins to call into question whether or not there even is a creator, let alone whether or not the creator just left. And then you get Karl Marx, who starts, kind of going along with this momentum and says, now, all right, so not only is God called into question, but this whole religious enterprise can be called into question. So religion becomes for him the opiate of the people. It's something that is given to people in order to anesthetize them, to kind of drug them to the crap that they're going on in their life. There's still a God up there in heaven. Just suck it up, believe in God, and everything will be good. And Karl Marx says all religion is used for is by certain people to prop themselves up. So religion is a force, a human construct that is used within society to keep people, in his mind, from rebelling and causing revolution. So it kind of created this idea of the church and religion and institutions can't even be trusted, let alone that there isn't a God. And then you figure it ended all with this guy named Freud, who starts saying that religion and a God is just a projection of human desires, and then he kind of sexualizes it all. And then people kind of feel squeamish about talking about God because this forerunner of psychology and therapy starts saying there's something wrong with people who think that there's this God because it's just projecting your sexual fantasies outside of yourself and written them large. And so in the modern world, you start having the collapse of any kinds of notions, not only of God, but also of the traditions and the creeds and the beliefs of religion in favor of science and human reason and human developments. And so within the modern world, you see the increase in technology. Because if there isn't a God, and if we are surviving and trying to be fit to overtake nature rather than be overtaken by nature, then humans must use their reason to develop technologies so that they don't lose to nature. And so you start having what people will now call the exploitation of nature. The development of technologies to use the world and its resources for the betterment of humans without any idea or concern for the world and nature itself. Because who gives a flying rip? Nature is here for us to conquer because, after all, we're just trying to survive in this blood, tooth, and claw environment. So you abandon God, you don't trust religion, now you're using science to overcome nature so that you can continue to survive. Well, what about these other people groups? What about people? You start, in the modern world, you start subjugating people also. Because after all, now this isn't just religion. It's not religion solely that is subjugating people. And it's certainly not religion that is the only source of slavery, that some people would say. Because Darwinian theories were used in the 18th and 19th centuries to legitimize slavery and the subjugation of people and the exportation of humans as a workforce, slave labor. Survival of the fittest. So when you get into the postmodern world is a rejection of the things that this mental environment held important. Reason, the rejection of tradition, and the elevation of science. Those three things, which were important here, are rejected in the postmodern world. This idea that science provides us with some kind of objectivity, the postmodern world says that's bullcrap, because there's no such thing as objective knowledge. Not even science provides us with objectivity, because, as the postmodernists would say, because the scientist and research and the funding for research is all based upon the things that this group of people wants to conquer and overcome. They want to provide you with something, or provide you with a service, or provide you with an industry, or provide you with a technology. So of course the scientist is going to have findings that support what they're trying to sell. That's the postmodern critique of modernism. Science isn't as objective as they say. You know, and a postmodernist might point to something like 20 years ago eggs were good, 10 years ago eggs were bad because it's cholesterol and it's a problem. But then you get the farmers' lobbyists, so now eggs are great, eat eggs. Research, funding, based upon what they're trying to sell. So the postmodernists, they reject this notion of objectivity. They reject this notion of human reason as being this transcendent organizing force. So what they start saying, they start using communities as the organizing substructure. It's not human reason, but rather it's communities. And communities are what form ways of seeing the world. And individuals are parts of communities, and communities form them and structure them, and an individual becomes indebted to a narrative that they are told. So within the postmodern world, you have those three names right there, Derrida, Foucault, and Rorty. The reason why I've picked these three out is because these three are important for Penner. In particular, Derrida is important because he recognized the modern world as providing a meta-narrative. This overarching story that told people this is how it is. This is how it is. This is how you have to see it, and don't question it. This is reality. And Derrida's like, come on now. We've got to deconstruct these meta-narratives. We have to deconstruct the stories. So on one hand, Derrida is a French literary critic, and he started off by talking about people tell you that there is meaning embedded within a story itself. And you've got to find out what the meaning of the story is. And he's like, that's bull. Meaning is created by the reader. All right? Okay, for all of you who already know all of this stuff, I know that I'm reducing this to a kind of sloganism. But I'm trying to thematize this into ideas for like bite-sized bits in order to help understand the logic behind Penner's critique. So over here, Derrida starts off as a literary critic. Those people who say that there's meaning in the story, Derrida's like, you've got to deconstruct that because we are the creators of meaning. The meaning of the story is the meaning that we have for it or that we give it. So you deconstruct the narrative and input the meaning based upon how it affects you. Okay? So then you have Foucault, who takes this idea of constructing the meaning in the text, and he starts saying all reality is a construct. Reality isn't something that's out there to be discovered. Reality is that which is interpreted. And we provide interpretations about what's happening and what is. And we use language to interpret reality. and to say that this is how it is. And so our language becomes for us a way of exerting power upon people. And so we start talking in a certain way, and we start saying that this is the way that it is, and our words become power because it develops a structure of seeing reality. So reality is interpreted, and it is interpreted by people who give language to interpret it. Now, Rorty comes in, whoops, there it is. Rorty comes in, and he says, building on the idea of deconstruction and building on the idea of interpreted reality and power games, he starts talking about two particular ideas, one of which Penner really likes, and that is irony. Irony. The other thing that I think Rorty is important for, and I'll talk about irony in a second, but the other thing that Rorty is important for is he rejects the idea that a postmodernist is a relativist. He rejects the idea that a postmodernist is a relativist because he says, look, we recognize that there's no objective truth out there. And we recognize that there's no reality that we have to discover and correspond to. We know all that stuff. But we aren't relativists because we don't say that anything goes. Rather, we talk to one another, human beings talk to one another, and they develop and interpret reality in such a way that they do it persuasively. The way that I talk about reality, I speak about it in such a way not to exert power over you, but to persuade you that my way of seeing things is right and true, and the things that I say cohere. This is very important, I think, for Rorty. Rather than our actions correspond to reason or God or nature, rather we cohere. Our stories cohere. The way that we see reality is coherent. And so we don't just say anything goes and today this and tomorrow that, but rather our story fits together. And I say a story, a way of interpreting reality, and you think that it sounds good and it seems right to you, and you buy into my story. And so we form a community of buy-in. And we say that for us, this is how reality is. This is how we see things. And because we see things together in community, because we see things in this way, this is how we act. This is how we act together. This is how we act toward one another. We even act in this way toward people who don't buy things the way that we see them. So now irony, this is where irony comes in. But you don't think that there's any objective truth. Yeah, this is where irony comes in. Rorty's like, we live and act as if this is the way things really are. But it's ironic. Because we know it's not really how they are. We live as if this is how it really is, but we know, ironically, that it isn't. This provides for Rorty a kind of tentativeness to every claim that an individual in a community makes. Tentative. We live as if it is this way, but we know that it isn't. So we're not going to make any domineering claims. We're just going to simply develop a narrative that coheres with our sense of the way things are. We are going to live according to it, always knowing that, it could be wrong. Right? The ancient world organizing principle is nature, and everything must act in accordance with nature, which is outside of them, but yet internal to them because it drives. Medieval world, everything must act in accordance with God, which is outside of them, but yet has imprinted or programmed them in such a way to act and correspond to the way that they were created. Human reason. Human reason, now it's internal. Now the organizing principle has turned to the human subject. And the way in which reality is seen and grasped is seen and grasped by the human subject who makes his or her categories according to the dictates of reason. Postmodern world. No, reality is interpretable. Meta-narratives are to be deconstructed. And stories must be offered so that we can develop communities who live in this world in such a way to be tentative, ironic, and yet committed. All right? So that is my rendition of the development of the Western world. Ancient world to the so-called Christendom or Christian world from the, probably, 380s into the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, Reformation. You move into, like the Reformation, Renaissance would be pre-modern, moving into the modern world with the Enlightenment, and then the postmodern world, which some people think started in the 60s, some people the 70s, some people say 1986. All right, and this is where Penner says we are in the Western world right now. So when he is offering up a postmodern apologetic, it's because he thinks this is where people in the Western society are, but Christian apologetics has oftentimes operated as a modern apologetics. Okay,